that's enough of that. Kind of got the idea that we're going to talk about World War II starting today. We've got a lot of stuff for you, not in any great detail, but there is a lot of information that we'll cover over the next couple of videos. It'll probably take two, just because I don't want to give you one that's an hour long. So we're going to be together about 30 minutes, and you just follow along. If you have any questions, feel free to email those to me. You can text your questions to me. I'm working on doing something maybe live later this week using a program called Zoom, and I've just got to figure that out, but I'll get it done, and we'll be able to communicate with each other that way. And again, it'll be something a little different for you to enjoy to look at. So World War II, of course, the seminal event of the 20th century. It was by far the event that had the largest impact, not just on the United States, but on the world, and on Georgia in particular. And we'll see that as we look, as you read in your textbook about World War II in Georgia and the impact that it had on the state. And it says, so what is it that starts World War II? Well, like the Civil War and like, the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 and every other war that we have talked about, it's really a series of things. There's that pile of explosives, and people keep adding to it, and then finally somebody lights the wick, or somebody lights the fuse, and that's all it takes. So there's some things that happened right after World War II, right at the end of World War I, rather. Excuse me, I'll do that for the next 3 days. But World War I that end up leading directly to World War II. And the first one is the Treaty of Versailles. If you remember, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles and how it was so unfair to Germany. You're talking billions in money that they're having to pay to Great Britain and France for civilian damage that had been caused in some other countries as well. So the Treaty of Versailles is incredibly harsh on Germany, and Germany begins to blame Western Europe, which would be France, Great Britain, and the United States for all of their difficulties. Life is not very pleasant in Germany following World War I, leading up to World War II, and that's, again, one of the reasons why Adolf Hitler comes to power, and one of the reasons that World War II kicks off. You can see just a little slide that talks about the Treaty of Versailles. Again, it's the peace agreement between Germany and the Allied powers. One thing that's kind of fortuitous here, someone is very forward-thinking, and you can see that they wrote, or actually it was a speech given by Ferdinand Foch, who was the chief of France. And if you remember the cartoon of Germany's depicted as a big, fat, out-of-shape guy, and then there's this ramrod straight French guy. His name was Foch. He had it written on his belt, I believe. But Foch said this, or expressed this. He said, "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." And he was exactly right. Almost 20 years later to the date, World War II breaks out. It's just peace for a little while. It's not going to be something that is lasting. And you see reparations. Reparations is a fancy word for you got to pay for this stuff. For Germany, it is 55 billion. Can I say that again? 55 billion. And McKay, how much money is that? Right, it's a lot of money. Oh, goodness. 55 billion. They cannot pay it back. They'll never pay it back. And so they're constantly going to be reminded of their failure as a nation, their failure as a government, every time they have to make a payment to France and Great Britain. And of course, $55 billion is just impossible. And so Germany is very bitter about that. There's some economic factors that come into play as well. The Great Depression is not just limited to the United States. It spreads around the world. There's tremendous unemployment. There's low economic activity. Remember, we saw those things in the United States, really beginning before 1929, but really coming to a head in 1929 and just becoming more and more difficult as the years went by. But the industrialized nations, Germany and Italy and Spain and France and Great Britain, are all impacted by the Great Depression, by these economic factors. And if you remember, one of the things that causes World War I to break out is intense nationalism. And we still see nationalism as we're approaching the latter part, the middle part, and then the latter part of the 1930s. We have a political ideology that begins to rise in Italy called fascism. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes. But also Nazism, and you've heard of the Nazi Party, you've heard of Nazism. And Japan is also kind of getting into it. All three of these would consider themselves superior to everyone else. Their needs are more important. And Japan begins to have colonial aspirations. They begin to colonize other countries. They actually invade China. And in fact, on my rolling card over there, there's a book entitled The Rape of Nanking. And the Japanese went in and did horrific, deplorable things to the civilian population of Nanking, China. Hang on, let me see who this is. Oh well, they didn't want to talk to me. Never mind. Katie, put your phone up, please. So, just like America turns to FDR because of his promises to end the Great Depression and return the United States to economic prosperity, there are people in Europe that do that as well. European nations begin to turn to people who are, in essence, dictators. They are practicers of fascism. And in Germany, Adolf Hitler promises to return Germany to prominence. In Italy, Benito Mussolini does the same thing. In Japan, you have Hideki Tojo, who's not only a dictator, he's the emperor, he's the king. And as such, he's not only the political head of the country, he's also the religious head of the country. In fact, he himself is considered to be a god. And that comes into play toward the end of World War II. In fact, the end of World War II as Douglas MacArthur, dictates terms for the surrender of Japan. He does not want Hideki Tojo to be tried for war crimes because not only is he their political leader, their government head, he is also their god, and that's how they view him. So, just a little off the subject. So what is fascism? It's really a political philosophy, a political ideology, a movement, a regime that exalts the nation. The needs of the nation are more important than anything else. So nation and race. And for Germany, it becomes this idea that the Germanic people, the pure, true Germanic people, are a superior race. And so one of the things that Adolf Hitler does is he pushes this idea. And he wants people who are blonde-headed and blue-eyed. He thinks they are the definitive German. He himself is not. In fact, he's not even German. He's Austrian. But he's very dynamic. He's very charismatic, and so people follow him. So fascism places the nation, the race, or a particular race above the individual. There's a very centralized government instead of state governments being able to make decisions for themselves. It would be the central government, the centralized government. And that comes into play in the German army as well. German commanders don't have the freedom to make decisions on their own. They have to wait for Hitler to make decisions for them. So there's a very strong centralized government. You've got a dictator, or one who may not call himself a dictator, but he is dictatorial in his leadership style. There is regimentation, not only of the economy, but also of society. And we see that as we begin to look at what the Nazi Party, that part of Germany, begins to do to people who don't fit in, who are different. And so we have economic and social regimentation. It's very structured. And if you're in opposition to the leadership, this is Mussolini, this is Adolf Hitler. If you're in opposition to that, you're going to be suppressed, you're going to be squashed. In essence, you're going to be rounded up, you're going to be thrown in jail, you're going to be killed, maybe. And so that's fascism in a nutshell. That's not the best explanation or the best definition of fascism I can give you, but it'll work for right now. You'll get into that a little more next year as you're studying world history and as you look at government a little bit. So, those three things are very important. And then we have what is called appeasement and isolationism. Okay? Appeasement and isolationism. England and France are still recovering from World War I. They see what's happening in the rest of, in other parts of Europe, and they begin to think, we don't want to be a part of this. We're going to isolate ourselves. Even worse than that, they're going to try to please or appease Hitler and Germany. It's almost like we're going to give them what they want, and if we give them what they want, they're going to leave us alone. Now, in essence, you have a bully. Germany's a bully, and you know what happens when you give a bully what he wants. He just keeps coming back for more. Until you stand up and punch him in the mouth, he's going to keep coming back for more. And so this idea of appeasement does not come close to solving the problems with Germany. The United States is one who practices isolationism. We don't want to be involved. Did that work with World War I? Was Woodrow Wilson able to keep the United States out of World War I by saying, "Oh, we don't care. We're going to stick our head in the sand," like Dr. Seuss is saying here, and we won't see it. It doesn't really exist. Okay? So this would be isolationism. We're just going to hide. We're not going to worry about what's going on in Europe. It's in Europe after all. This is kind of an example of nationalism. America first. Look for the needs of America. Keep the U.S. out of the war. Not necessarily nationalism, but that was the viewpoint of many people. And then this cartoon over here, again, it is a Dr. Seuss cartoon. You've got this multi-headed monster with the Nazi swastikas on it, all representing Germany. And this little guy out here on this little rock, this little island, represents England. And what has he got? He's got lollipops. He's giving out lollipops. He's trying to appease Germany. And he's never going to have enough lollipops. He's never going to appease this multi-headed monster that exists. So appeasement, isolationism, neither one of them work. Neither one of them really accomplish what they set out to accomplish. And then we've got this cartoon. This is not a Dr. Seuss cartoon. We're going to look at actually quite a few of those. But it's kind of an interesting cartoon. You've got this three-headed monster, Japan, Germany, and Italy. Okay? And if you notice, the date on the little baby over here is what? Gracie, you're right, it's 1942. And then if you look down at the book that's open, it's a biblical reference, and it is what, Sarah J? David and Goliath, and David slew the giant. At this point in time, in 1942, the United States is not ready to fight a war. The Army is almost non-existent. The Navy has begun to prepare for war under the leadership of Carl Vinson. He's actually the chairman of the Armed Forces Committee, and this is why we call him the father of the two-ocean Navy. He saw the need to build a Navy that could operate in both oceans, the Atlantic and Pacific. And you see, this is truly a giant against this little baby, but that little baby begins to fight back. The Allies begin to fight back, and by the end of 1942, things look much different than they did at the beginning or end of 1941. So, here we have 4 countries. And you'll notice when we get to it, there's one that we haven't talked about yet, but Japan is led by Emperor Hirohito. Again, he's not only the government figurehead, but he's also the god. He attacks China, and you can't imagine a country as small as Japan attacking a country as large as China. But China was really still in the 19th century when it came to their military, so you had modern weaponry, modern armament going against horses. And China was just going to lose. There were actually Americans who were flying airplanes on behalf of the Chinese. They were fighting on behalf of the Chinese before the United States ever entered the war. Italy had Mussolini. He picks on Ethiopia and Albania. Those are both, well, one is an African country and one is an Eastern European country. Germany, of course, Adolf Hitler. He's the leader of the Nazi Party. He begins to rebuild Germany's military forces under the Treaty of Versailles. They weren't allowed to have but so many soldiers, so many ships, so many airplanes. Hitler ignores that. Britain, France, and the United States all ignore the fact that he ignored that, so we had a big ignore fest. And it didn't turn out very well for anybody. He begins to persecute the Jews. He blames the Jews for a lot of Germany's problems. And of course, he begins to silence anyone who speaks out against what he is doing. And then the country we haven't noticed or haven't brought any attention to is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was actually created during World War I. You remember Vladimir Lenin leads the Russian Revolution, and communism becomes the form of government in the Soviet Union. What Stalin does is he's building an industry, he's building up the military, he forces peasants into really what are concentration camps. They call them collectives. It's where they are farming. And he also gets rid of people that don't agree with him. Stalin is a much worse mass murderer than Adolf Hitler is. Stalin kills somewhere in the neighborhood of 21 million Russians or people who were citizens of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union begins as a part of the Axis forces. Hitler turns on Stalin, Germany turns on the Soviet Union, and they fight with the Soviet Union ends up becoming part of the Allied. They're actually part of the big three. You've got the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. So, September 1st, 1939 is what we would say is the official start date of World War I. Germany attacks Poland because Poland had an agreement with France and England. France and England come to their aid. At that point in time, it really doesn't matter Germany is just overwhelming. At the same time, Japan and Italy are at war. They're trying to take over different places. And once again, the world is divided into two armed camps. You've got the Axis powers, who we would call the bad guys. If you were in Germany today, might be a different thing, but it would be a different perspective. From the world's perspective, though, Germany is the aggressor. The Axis powers are the aggressors, and they are considered not only to be enemies, but they are considered to be evil. And so we talk. At some point in time, you may have an ethics class where you're talking about history and ethics, and you'll hear the term a just war. Is it a justified war? Is it something that people should have gone to war over? And World War II is definitely what we would call a just war. People went to war, and we'll think about the United States. The United States went to war because if they hadn't, evil would have been victorious, and evil would have changed the world that we live in. So the Allies, and you have the big three represented here. There's Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Winston Churchill from England, everybody knows about him. He actually is also a citizen of the United States. He has dual citizenship. Franklin D. Roosevelt, and you can see Roosevelt seated in his chair. You can see how thin his legs are. And then Joseph Stalin. One of the things that happens at this conference that these three are attending is Churchill gets his feelings hurt. And you can see in the picture, he doesn't look very happy. Roosevelt and Stalin begin to grow closer together. And Roosevelt realizes that in order for the United States or for the Allies to be victorious, it's not going to be up to the United States and Britain. It's going to be up to the United States and the Soviet Union. And in the end, it really is. But there are four large countries that are considered allies: Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and of course, the United States comes in after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Beginning of the war, the Axis powers actually have the upper hand. They conquer much of Europe. You can see on the map here, much of that has been occupied by the Soviet Union. Here's Italy, of course. France is kind of divided into Nazi Germany France, or Nazi France, occupied France is what it's called, and then Free France. When U.S. troops move into Africa, when British troops move into Africa, they're actually met by French troops who fight against them. And then that table turns. But you can see Albania, Italy, Africa is controlled somewhat by the Italians, not entirely. So early on, Germany has the upper hand. They've actually extended. They begin to march to the east, toward the Soviet Union, toward Moscow, and that was a huge mistake on the part of Adolf Hitler. Again, at the beginning, the United States says, "Whoa, we don't want to be involved with this. There are two bullies, or there's a bully and he's picking on somebody littler. We're just going to stand back and watch it happen." So they remain neutral. And of course, they don't remain neutral forever. All right, 1938, Germany attacks France. And the reason they attacked France is to take back land that had been given to them under the Treaty of Versailles, land that had been lost to France, called the Rhineland. And nobody really makes a big deal of it. France doesn't really care. It's not much of an invasion. It's not much of an attack. And so they almost give back the Rhineland to Germany. Again, they send troops to Poland, of course, but also Austria, which they felt had always been a part of Germany, and then Czechoslovakia. So all of those are controlled by the Germans. After Poland is attacked in September of 1939, Great Britain and France declare war, and the Soviet Union begins to invade nearby countries on their border, and they agree to split Poland with Germany. So you can see the Soviet Union is actually fighting with the Axis powers at this point. By 1940, and you saw it on the map, Hitler controls Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and most of France. And they began to bomb Great Britain. And that's called the Battle of Britain. It's actually an air battle. It was the first truly air battle that was ever fought in the world. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and the British Air Force fight over the skies of England. And if you go to England today, you'll see the scars of that still. So what's the United States doing? Not much. They are involved, but most Americans don't want to go to war. Remember, Great Depression, they have seen what happens when a country goes to war, and they don't want to be a part of it. It's a European problem. It's not our problem. But Roosevelt, at the same time, realizes if we don't help, if we don't assist Germany and France, or excuse me, Great Britain and France, this is going to end badly for everybody. And so they begin to do some things to help Britain. It is a tremendous issue. It goes to nationalism. Okay, it's not our problem. We're over here, they're over there. Let them deal with it. You know, they're trying to appease. Great Britain is even still trying to appease Germany, and it's just not going to work. Well, now let me talk about this cartoon. It's by Dr. Seuss, and here you have Europe. You have the Stalin itch. You have Hitleritis. You got the Blitzpox. That's what the German attacks were called because they were so fast. You've got Nazi fever, fascist fever, and the Italian mumps, all over here. And what's Uncle Sam saying? This is Uncle Sam. He's saying, "What a lucky thing we've got separate beds. There's no possible chance of us being infected by this." But we know what? When an event happens in one part of the world, it has an impact on every other part of the world. And you guys are living through that right now. With COVID-19, we know where it started, and now it is a pandemic. It has spread throughout the world. It has impacted and infected the rest of the world. So what the United States was doing really doesn't work. And Dr. Seuss is speaking out against that, actually. Theodore Geisel is speaking out against that, using the power of the political cartoon. We're going to do some work with some of these political cartoons. So what happens? Hitler turns on Stalin in 1941. He invades the Soviet Union. It doesn't end well for him. He did not count on supply lines that were going to be so long, thousands of miles long, and he didn't count on the Russian winter being as bad as it was, and it was bad. The United States begins what is called the Lend-Lease program, and it is simply a policy that said, okay, we're going to lend you, or we're going to rent you weapons. And they begin to do that. They begin to lend weapons to Great Britain. They begin to lend weapons to the Soviet Union. And you can see this is a ship that is carrying Lend-Lease items to Great Britain. And think about that for just a minute. Roosevelt's able to sell that idea. We're not selling it to them. We're going to lend it to them. We want it back when they get through with it. So you're going to give Great Britain a tank or an airplane. It's going to get shot up, and they're going to give it back to us, right? Yeah. So it's really a way that Roosevelt is able to give aid to Great Britain and the Soviet Union without actually being involved in the war. In the North Atlantic, the American ships, we have American warships that begin to escort British ships across convoys. And there's a great story from March of 1942 that I will tell you. In fact, you're going to read about it. I think I'm going to tell you about it, and then you're going to read about it. But it involves a graduate of GMC. It's a pretty interesting story, pretty creepy story when you get right down to it. So, we're going to stop right there. We've gone about 30 minutes, so we'll stop right here. Again, I hope you're doing well. We've been at this for a week now. This should be Monday, March 23rd. So, again, we've been at it for a week. I hope you've been able to get everything done you need to get done. Again, I've heard from a lot of you today. This is Tuesday, March the 17th. It's St. Patrick's Day, so I'm showing my Irish green. Hey, it's almost time to go. So, again, I hope things are going well. Again, if you've got problems, you've got questions, you can call me, you can email me, you can text me. A lot of you have texted. A lot of you left message on the YouTube video, and I appreciate that. Just want you to know, we're going to get through this. We're working hard every day. We're actually going to begin working from home tomorrow, so the next video you get from me will look a little different. I may be able to come back up here and record it here, but it may be done at home, and it'll look a little different than it does right now. So stay safe. Don't do anything stupid. Remember, I love you. Miss Grimes says hey. Miss Janaka says hey. And Miss Spencer said hey. Until next time, which will be in a day or so, take care of yourselves. Love you. And we'll talk to you later.